Okay, let's get started. How's everybody doing? Okay, good. Welcome to The Words of the Same, Writing Games versus Writing Fiction. I have to confess the title is a little misleading because it is not The Words of the Same, it is The Words of the Same and just about everything else is different. And it's not writing games versus writing fiction, there's no conflict there, it's more an orthogonal thing. But as someone who has written both, I think there's valuable lessons to be learned about writing for one versus writing the other. So let's start with who I am and why I'm telling you this. My name is Richard Dansky. I'm the central Clancy writer for Ubisoft. I've been writing video games for 22 years. I've worked on somewhere around 70 games. I've sort of lost track. I'm a published author. I have 8 novels out, including most recent one, Ghost of a Marriage, and 1 short story collection. I'm an extensively published tabletop RPG author. I basically write a lot of stuff in a lot of different genres. And I like to think that that experience is something that can be potentially useful to you. I'll share it with you today. So let's start with the basics. Fiction versus game writing, they are not the same thing. Each of them has unique skill set, each of them has unique needs. Thinking you can cross over from one to the other seamlessly is not the case because you need to learn what the demands of each are. One is not easier than the other. I know folks who've gone from one to the other going, oh, it's just game writing, it's going to be easy. No. I know people who've been game writers who've tried novels and thought, okay, it's going to be easy, there's no interactivity. No. Each of them has unique and specific demands. Each of them has its own hardships and obstacles to overcome. And you need to recognize that they are unique forms, not just variants on one another. And something that I cannot overstate, all writing deserves to be treated with respect. There is no one form that is lesser than one another. There is no one form that is greater than one another. They are all worthy of respect, admiration for the labor that is put in, for the creativity, for the energy, for the effort. Can you do both? Yes, I'm living proof. See, I've done both and I'm still here. But they use different writing muscles. I actually go to work at my office every day so I can have an airlock of a 20-minute ride home so I can clear my mind of my game writing and get ready for my fiction writing in the evening. And don't assume that the skill of one automatically translates to the other, because they don't. They are very, very different skill sets, and you need to know which one you're writing for, which tools to apply, which tools to use, which skills are going to be needed for the particular project you're writing for. What do we start with? We start with the text. In fiction, the text is the whole product. A book is a book is a book is a book. In games, the text is part of the whole. The script is part of what's made, but it is only a small part. It is a function of the greater machine. It is fed in and tied to other disciplines. It does not drive the process. It is not the end product of the process. It is part of the process. And bearing that in mind is perhaps the biggest difference between the two. There's something that I really enjoy about fiction, which is that I work alone. I get to control everything that happens. But at the same time, I really enjoy working in games because I collaborate with other departments, other people, other skills, other talents, and get to see how my writing impacts what they do and how what they do impacts my writing. Is there overlap between the two forms? Absolutely. Plotting. Everybody needs a plot, right? Yes? No? Yes? Come on. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Just making sure you're still there with me. Okay, there's structure. 3-act structure is a 3-act structure, whether it's in a novel or a game. There's wordsmithing, the actual act of writing, the actual act of creation. Yes, you have to have good words no matter what you're doing. And there's iteration. Nobody wants to publish a first draft, and that's true for novels or for games. I have unfortunately had games where the time was so tight that we did publish first draft. I won't mention those games because it's too embarrassing. But the point is that, yes, there is overlap between the two. A good wordsmith can learn to do one, can learn to do the other. You can function in both worlds with equal facility, just recognizing that you are in a different world. Workflow. In fiction, you write alone. Yes, sometimes you collaborate. I have collaborated on a novel that went terribly, so we won't talk about it. But you generally sit there and it is your work. You decide what happens. You make it go. You decide where it starts, where it stops, what happens, the good points, the bad points, the jokes, everything is on you. In games, you collaborate across the team. For example, if I want to change a line in the game that I'm currently working on, I need to talk to a bunch of people. I need to talk to the voice director to make sure that we can actually get that line recorded. I need to talk to level design to make sure that we can actually get it in the game. I need to talk to mission design to make sure that it supports the flow of the mission. I need to talk to the realization director to make sure we can get it recorded properly in a motion capture shoot. I need to talk to QA to make sure they test the line. I need to talk to localization to make sure they translate the line. All of those people impact everything that I do, and I impact everything that they do. And so it is a very different workflow. You cannot just cowboy off when you're writing games. You have to go within the process and make sure that what you are doing aligns with what everybody else on the team is doing. Does that make sense? Yeah. As opposed to writing when I can sit down, pour myself a glass of scotch, turn on some Dream Theater, and just go to work. See, I told you this presentation was going to be metal. Customers. Who is your writing for? The best writing advice I ever got was at a writing conference when I was in high school from a man named George Sithers, who was the publisher of Weird Tales magazine. And he said it comes down to three things. Have something to say it, and say it to someone. That means have an idea to write, actually sit down and write it, and then get it to people. But the people you get it to are very different in games and in fiction. You may think that, oh yeah, no, I'm just writing for the player. You are not. You are writing for everybody else on the team who is possibly going to use your stuff. At the beginning of the project, when you're doing world building, when you're doing character design, you are writing to concept artists. You are writing to people who are going to be building models. You are writing to people who are going to be building the levels. They are your customers. They are the recipients of your writing when you're building a world. When you're later on, when you're writing scripts, you are writing to actors, you are writing to voice directors, you are writing to level designers, you are writing to other people on the team. Yes, the player is the person who is going to take this at the end. Yes, the person is the customer who ultimately receives it. But in the meantime, you have customers on your team that you need to write for. You need to be aware of their needs. You need to be aware of what they want, what they need to do their jobs, and you need to provide it. In fiction, your end customer is basically your reader. Yes, there are editors. Yes, there are agents. These are people who will tell you how to make your book better or to write an entirely different book. Or in some cases, they'll tell you nothing at all, but that's a whole other issue. But they will tell you what you need to do to write a story to make it better, but ultimately you are writing for the reader. And there's no one else who needs to do their work based on what you're writing. Plotter versus pantser. How many people know what plotters and pantsers are? No. Okay. This is a fiction term, and it's about how you write. A plotter is someone who sits down, outlines their book, lays out their plot in advance, they plot the book. A pantser is someone who writes by the seat of their pants. I am personally a pantser. I sit down and I trust my subconscious is going to tell me what the book is about. I'm currently 30,000 words into my current novel and it has not given me a clue yet. All I know is that there's a character named Mr. Buttons. But you cannot pants in a video game because there are so many dependencies, because everything in a game has to get made, because none of the rules of the world apply. Everything has to be built from the ground up. You cannot pants a video game. You need to plot it. You need to plot it in intricate detail. You need to plot in collaboration. You need to plot how much dialogue there's going to be, who's going to say it, how many actors you're going to get to say it. All of these things have to come true for you to make a game. If you just try and pants it, you will find yourself in a morass of process nightmares, and your game will go nowhere. Whose story is it? Well, it's easy for the writer to say, it's my story, but that's not true. In fiction, the story belongs to the hero, the protagonist of the game. of the book. In fiction, Frodo is the hero. Frodo is the one who bears the ring to Mordor. Frodo's got it all going on. In games, it's the player. How many of you have ever played a game, then told somebody about what you did and said, Master Chief did this, Ellie did this, Sam Fisher did this? I'm guessing none of you. How many of you told a story that said, I did this? Okay. You are the hero of the game. It is your story. I firmly believe that as a narrative director and writer for video games, what I create is not story. I create narrative. I create the props and the set pieces and the instances that you interact with as a player, and then once you interact, that moment becomes your story. The story belongs to the player. It is not there to stroke the writer's ego. It is there for the player to enjoy and have a great experience with. So what's the trick to game writing? In a word, interactivity. See, it's a word, it's right there. It means writing to the possibility space of the player might do at any given moment. What can a player do at any given moment? Well, they can stand there, they can crouch, they can kneel, they can reload, they can shoot, they can roll left, they can roll right, they can throw a grenade, they can do nothing at all. A friend of mine in the business used to have what he called the cigarette test for a game, which was if he could stop in the middle of a gunfight, hide behind a rock, go out and smoke a cigarette, come back and his character was still alive, he didn't want to play that game anymore. I do not condone smoking, by the way. But it's interactivity. You have to write to what the player might do, and you have to make sure that what you write feels good no matter what the player does. You write to the possibility space of anything the player might choose to do at a given moment. Now, those possibilities are constrained by the rules of the game, what you can do and what you can't do. You, for example, can't break into a Bollywood dance number in a Splinter Cell game because we don't have the animations for that or anything like that. But the point being is that you want to, excuse me, you want to write to what the player can do and might do at any given moment so that it feels right. So when they're telling their story, it always feels like a good time. It always feels like they made the right decision. Making sense so far? Okay. The player-shaped hole. This is a term I came up with a while ago for what you're writing to. Every game story has a player-shaped hole in the middle of it. That's where the player slots in. That's what the player decides to do. And you write to the player-shaped hole. You make sure that everything you do leaves room for the player to do the cool stuff, leaves room for the player to say the cool lines. You are not writing your story. You are not showing off how clever you are. You are not showing off your witty dialogue. You are giving the player a chance to shine. That is what it's about. How do you write to it? Well, that's the trick. That's the trick of writing games as opposed to fiction. You write to what the player could do. You write around the player. You write around what they're going to do, and you make sure that what they are shown is interesting to them, but not the cool stuff. You don't want to make sure you don't want the player to think, this is what I should be doing at any given moment when an NPC does it. You want to write so that the player gets to do all the cool stuff. The player continually gets to be the hero of the story. So there's a lot of stuff you don't need to do in games. You don't need to do descriptive text. You don't need to do mood. You don't need to do tone. You don't need to do synonyms for the word said. At least not in script writing. Why not? Well, it's because you've got an art department. You've got an audio department. You've got other people there to do all that. I don't need to write that it's dark. We have a lighting artist who's there to make sure that the level is dark. I don't need to write, so my character's not going to say, gosh, it's dark in here, when the player can see that it is pretty bloody dark all by themselves. I'm not going to say it sure is windy when there's an audio treatment for wind that lets them know, when there's animation for trees showing branches whipping back and forth. I don't need to do any of that as a game writer, at least not writing dialogue. Except when you do. When you're writing things like character descriptions for concept artists and character artists, then you need to include things like that. then you need to have your description, then you need to have your details, then you need to have those words that don't come into the game itself. But again, it's a question of remembering who your customers are. It's a question of who you're writing for. A concept artist needs to know what someone looks like, what someone dresses like, what someone moves like. A player doesn't need to know that. A player will see it on screen. Nonverbal storytelling. This is the stuff you do in collaboration with other people. Take a look at that picture. It's from Dark Souls, I believe. What do we have there? We have broken down architecture. We have dim lighting. We have an overcast sky. We have what looks like a guy with a sword and a tattered cape. We have all these things that are built into the world without saying a single word. Do we understand the scenario we are dealing with here? Is this a place you'd want to be? Not unless you were the large dude with the sword. And so you collaborate. You say, when you're talking to level design, hey, I want this space to be spooky. You don't say, well, this building should have 6 crenellations, and this one should have a gambrel roof. And no, you don't do that. You trust other people to do their jobs. One of the great game writing stories that I've ever heard came from Mary Tomorrow. And she was talking about a script meeting that she was having where she was getting critiques from other teams. And she said, and I quote, "If you trusted me to do my job the way I trust you to do yours, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Trust the rest of the team to do their jobs. Trust the artists to make cool stuff. Trust the sound engineers to make cool audio. Trust the character modelers to make cool characters. Trust them to tell your story in ways that you cannot. The game writing is more than just dialogue, as I said. It is character designs. The picture you see there is a book called The World of Might and Magic, which was a hastily assembled version of my world-building notes for the Might and Magic franchise for Ubisoft. I apologize to anyone who bought it. It was not edited. But what it is, it's a compilation of everything that we did for character design, for story, for building factions in the world, for building the history of the world, for building the map of the world. Everything that was there, that all went into that book. And that's some of what you do as a game writer that is, again, very different from what you do in fiction. Yes, when you do fiction, you world build for your novel, but you world build for yourself. For a game, you are world building for the people who are going to be building the stuff that you're actually putting up there. You also have setting documentation. That's just research on where you're going, what you're doing. But again, that's invaluable to artists. That is invaluable to people who will be building this stuff. They are the ones who are going to be taking your words and turning them into assets. And you need to be as clear and concise as possible. You need to be as detailed as possible. I know that sounds like it fights against each other, but after you do this for a while, you get really good at saying a lot with a few words. Game dialogue. Game dialogue and book dialogue are very, very different animals. I often tell people that some of the best practice you can get for writing game dialogue is actually writing on Twitter. At least this was true before they upped the character limit. The idea being that you have to get across a complete thought in a very limited character space. But when you're writing game dialogue, you want to keep it short, you want to keep it punchy, especially if it's going to be voiced. Not every game has voice dialogue, and you don't want to step on the gameplay. The last thing that you want is for a character to be babbling on while the player turns around and goes and hacks and works. Because 1, they might miss some vital information. 2, it makes the NPC look like an idiot that they're still talking while you're hacking orcs. But the ultimate lesson underneath this is that the player wants to play. The player does not want to hear your sharp dialogue. The player does not want to hear you as the writer be witty. The player doesn't even want to always spout witty lines for themselves. The player wants to play. And so you keep the dialogue as tight as possible. You practice it, you make sure you cut it down, you trim it, You make sure that you are telling the story in as few words as possible so the player can get back to playing. Ideally, your dialogue is sometimes happening during gameplay in a way that helps tell the story through the action. But you definitely don't want to step on the action. You don't want to have a conflict between dialogue and gameplay where a player has to choose one or the other and inevitably loses by that choice. So one of the things you do is you read it out loud. Yes, I know that's a picture of Kermit the Frog. You read it out loud to hear what it sounds like. I read every line of dialogue I write out loud, which gets me some funny looks at the office. But fortunately, there are very few people at the office, so I get very few funny looks. And when you do that, you listen for bumps and pauses. You listen for places where it doesn't seem natural. You listen for places where you stop, where you stutter, where you take a break, and then you go back and you cut those places out. You also do what are called table reads. Table reads are when you get everybody around the table, all the stakeholders, and you actually read the script out loud like you're doing the scene. And those are great for getting a good idea of how long a scene is, whether it's too long, whether it bumps, whether certain lines are too long, whether lines that look good on the page don't sound good spoken. That is a key thing, by the way. Just because it looks beautiful on the page doesn't mean it sounds good when it's spoken. I would recommend to all the works of Mr. Ray Bradbury, who is a fantastic, fantastic fiction author. His dialogue is practically unreadable when you speak it out loud. And finally, we have what I call the Kermit test. And yes, the Kermit test. When I do the Kermit test, I take a line, I read it out loud. If I feel compelled to read it in a funny voice, in my case, Kermit the Frog, then I know that line needs to change. And I know that sounds silly, but you will do this. You will read your stuff out loud, and all of a sudden you'll get to something that just doesn't flow right, and you'll feel compelled to say it in a silly voice. And when you do that, you know that you have hit a place that you need to make changes, where you need to go back and rewrite. Don't be afraid of rewriting. You should embrace the process of rewriting. You should embrace the process of reading the stuff out loud, finding where it doesn't work, cleaning those spaces out, going back, rereading, doing multiple table reads, and getting that sound so that it is as good as possible. Actors are fickle creatures. We've got one in the back of the room who's got his arms crossed, staring at me right now. Okay, he's uncrossed his arms. You want to make the job as easy for them as possible. On the other hand, writing fiction dialogue, you can take as long as you need. One of my rules for writing game dialogue is that I max out at 3 exchanges, A, B, A, B, A, B, and we're done. In fiction, you can have conversations that go on for pages and pages. Read Proust. On second thought, don't. Written dialogue doesn't need to sound natural and spoken. Like I said, Ray Bradbury's stuff is mellifluous. It is gorgeous. It is beautiful. He is my favorite author. I would not want to read his stuff out loud for fear of tripping over my own tongue. Another benefit of writing fiction dialogue is that characters won't wander away in the middle of a line. If you give players agency, they will do whatever they want to do. They will not necessarily stand there for the whole conversation. They will go see what else there is. They will go see if there's a crate to smash. They will go see if there's a chest to open. They will go see if there's an orc to smite. In fiction, you don't have to worry about that because you tell character, stay here. They stay. It's nice. And the action doesn't start in the middle of a line unless you want it to. So those are all differences in fiction writing dialogue as opposed to game writing dialogue. You can blossom more writing fiction dialogue, but at the same time, you're writing for a very different purpose. One thing that is unique to games that you will never, ever, ever do in fiction is systemic dialogue, or BARTs. They are unique to games. They are lines that play when the state of the game changes. They are there to inform the player that something has changed. They are indicative of that change in the game state. They're usually short, they're punchy, they comprise of one fact and one fact only. A bark that is long and detailed is a bark that is bad. I once got asked to write a bark for a series of maneuvers that were, I'll go around the side of the house, you throw a grenade on the roof. Now imagine writing 10 variants for that. On second thought, don't. There are an awful lot of them. These are actually the lines of dialogue that the players will hear most in a game. On the Division 2, we had 88,000 of them. And there were all variants on grenade. No. But they are the lines the players will hear most, because what's the player going to be doing through most of the game? Playing. When is the state going to change? When they play, when they shoot a bad guy, when they get shot, when they need to reload, when the bad guy needs to reload, you name it. And so they will hear these an awful lot, which is why they need to be short and unmemorable. If a line is memorable and one character says it, that's cool. If 2 characters say it, that's kind of weird. If 10 characters say it, okay, you're a YouTube sensation. Pacing. Pacing is vital to a game, but you don't control it as the writer. The player controls their progress. Even the most tightly scripted rail shooter, the player can take time to stop, go back, go left, go right, not go forward. They can sit there and do my friend's cigarette break if they really want to. In gameplay pacing versus narrative pacing, you are fighting for the quiet moments. You don't always want everything to be exploding all at once. One game I worked on, every single time I proposed a quiet moment of just character development, my creative director would look at me and go, but where's the conflict? And the answer was there was none. Because those moments were designed to be quiet, they were designed to be reflective, they were designed to tell us what we were fighting for in the moments when there was conflict. And so narrative pacing versus gameplay pacing can be a struggle. How many people here have played The Last of Us? Would you say that the giraffe scene is one of the most memorable scenes from that game? Yes? Yeah. What happens in that scene? Nothing. You sit there and you watch some giraffes. But what that does is it breaks up the pacing. It slows you down, allows you some time to recover from all the frenetic shooting and running and gunning, and allows you to see that these characters are human and that you can have a reason to do the running and gunning. You have a reason to support these characters. You have a reason to want them to live because, hey, they've had a moment of just being human right there. That's narrative pacing. That's something that you have to fight for, as opposed to just the pacing of the gameplay. One thing that's very difficult to do in a game is bring the villain on stage. Why? Because the player wants to shoot them. And if you make the villain unshootable, the player gets frustrated. If you make the villain unshootable, the player says, why am I even here? And goes off and plays something else. It is hard to keep the player from shooting them while allowing agency. It's a lot easier to do this in fiction. You can bring, in fiction, the heroic character is not expected to win until the end. That's the bluntest way to put this. In games, the player is expected to have wins all the way along, leaving Dark Souls aside. And so when the player is confronted with the villain, they want to have the agency to do something to them, even if it's something small. They want to have the power of agency to leave their mark. This is why in a lot of games, when the villain is brought on stage early, it's only during a cutscene, so the player can't do anything, so the player can't feel powerless, so the player can't say, I tried to do something and I failed. In fiction, you bring the bad guy on stage early, you establish them doing something horrible like killing puppies to show that they're the bad guy. Not that I advocate this. And you show the power imbalance between the hero and the villain at the beginning of the game, or the beginning of the novel, is not a big deal, because you know that the character is going to progress and eventually, hopefully, get equal and be able to do something about this nasty person. Changing perspective. This is doable in fiction. In games, it is very, very difficult. It requires different characters, new viewpoint character, new animations, new character models, new everything. I can jump back and forth between Frodo and Aragorn if I'm writing Lord of the Rings fanfic. All I have to do is type Frodo. All I have to do is type Aragorn. I'm good. In a game, that requires a different character, that requires a different model, different animation set, presumably a different setting, you name it. And so games generally don't allow for that. And some game types physically don't allow for that. Internal monologues. How many people here have an internal monologue? Okay, so you know they're a useful fiction device, right? It's always good to have the character explain stuff to themselves and thus explain stuff to the reader. It's hard to do in a game because you never know when the player is going to have enough time to have a completed thought. Now, in some cases, it's very useful for a line like that, an internal monologue, to cover a load or something like that, where you know the character is going to be walking through a long tunnel where there's nothing else happening. But generally, you don't know that there's going to be enough time for the thought to be completed. And also, players tend to resent being told what they're thinking. If you invest in a character, you really invest in a character. You don't want to be told what they're thinking. You don't want to be told what your mindset is. You know what your mindset is. You're playing. You're invested in the character. All this making sense so far? Okay, cool. Scope. Scope. Game developer's favorite word. In fiction, you can write literally anything. If I say 10,000 orcs came over the hill, well, golly, we got 10,000 orcs. In games, you are limited by hardware and software limitations. Those orcs are not coming over that hill, not without causing the engineers a heart attack, not without causing AI a heart attack, not without causing a mutiny on the team, and generally one dead writer. So you write to what the game can support. If this game can support a half dozen characters on screen, then you write to a half dozen characters on screen, and you have a lot of noise in the background for those other 9,994. And it's one of the great things about fiction is that you can write literally anything. And it's there, it's all imagination. But once you have to realize it, once you have to make it appear on screen, once you have to make it act believably, once you have to make it a part of a world, then it starts getting tight. Interactions. In fiction, you can have any interaction that you can imagine. In gameplays, that is bounded by technology. So the story I'm going to tell you is a little bit out of date, but I think it holds true. On my very first game, which we will not mention by name, the end of the game was supposed to be a romantic clinch between the heroine and one of the male characters. And I wrote this, and I wrote the cinematic, and I was very pleased with myself, and the lead engineer came over to my desk, and he said, "We can't do that." And I said, "Okay, can I get a hug?" And he said, "We can't do that either." And I said, "Can I get a handshake?" "No." I said, "What can you give me?" And he said, "I can give you a curt nod." So we rewrote the ending of the game. But again, this is a case of writing to the limitations of the hardware and the technology. If it doesn't allow for interpersonal interactions, then you can't write them. Then you shouldn't write them. And you should know not to write them. You should know not to ask for them. And this goes back to collaborating with other members of the team. You should know before you set pen to paper what is possible, what is not. A great example that my friend Zach Bush used the other night at dinner talked about having a character adjust a purse strap. Well, is there a purse in the game? Do we have time to model a purse? Do we have an animation for adjusting a purse strap? Do we have any of these things? You should know all these things before you write the line about the purse strap. Cuts. Everybody loves cuts. How many people here have worked on a project where there have been cuts? Aren't they the best? Somebody said no unironically. This is good. Now in fiction, you make your own cuts. This is called editing, and it's part of the process. In games, the cuts are generally imposed. If they are sometimes necessary, they are sometimes unavoidable. Ideally, you are in the conversation as to what gets cut, so you can minimize the damage. But there will be cuts, and then you need to stitch up the damage afterwards. You need to repair storylines that get damaged after cuts. You need to find out where those cuts are going to come and make sure that you know what's been removed from the game and what needs to stay. You need to find the lines you draw in the sand. You need to find the hill you're going to die on. Sometimes you are going to die on that hill, and that cut's going to happen anyway, and then you go and do your best job regardless, because that's what you're there to do. But one of the things that is unfortunate is that the giraffe moments are generally the first thing to go. The quiet moments, the character development moments, the ones that don't have gameplay, those are generally the first thing to go. You have to learn to live with this, and you have to learn to insert character development elsewhere. You develop characters through dialogue, you develop characters through animation, you develop characters through dress, you develop characters through their props. All these things are going to take the place of those quiet moments that get cut. Length. A book is as long as it is. Or in the case of George R.R. Martin, as long as it isn't. The length is determined by the plot. It goes as long as it needs to. It tells its story. A game's length is determined by gameplay. Narrative has to support the entire playthrough. Now, the idea being that your story is there to support the gameplay through the very last moment. The idea is to have the player engaged and immersed in the fiction so that they are propelled forward to the end of the game by the narrative propulsion of the storyline. You cannot end a story long before the end of a game, or can you? Well, as a matter of fact, yes you can. It's called games as a service. And here's another big difference between fiction and games. Books have endings. They may be the second one in a series, they may be the second one in a trilogy, but they have definitive endings. Games, you can finish all the narrative content and still keep playing. There's always more ocelots to skin. There's always more ships to conquer. There's always more blocks to clean up in New York and the Division. And so you need to write for that. You need to build a world that is accepting of the fact that there will be things to do after the main gameplay is done, after the main storyline is finished. There's always room for addition in fiction, but every book, every story comes to an end. So, conclusions. Writing fiction and writing for video games are, surprise, surprise, very different. Yes, there is some overlap, but there's not a whole heck of a lot. No, you cannot use the same skill set for both, and be prepared to be flexible in what you leave in and what you take out. Any questions?
So I know you mentioned two separate things of one, when you're writing for an audience of like your own team, you need to make sure you keep a lot of details, but keep them concise in order so that they get all the information they need without being overwhelmed. But there are some parts you want to leave to their discretion. How do you know where to draw that line of what you should leave to them and what you should be explicit about?
If somebody calls a meeting to talk about it, then you need to put in more detail. That's generally what it comes down to. The question was, where do you know when to put in more detail and when to leave it alone? And if somebody else is asking for more detail, then I give it to them. I try and give as much detail as I can from the beginning. I have a standard format for things like character descriptions where I will detail who the character is, what their background is, what they look like, how they move, what their voice is like, so we can have that for voice notes when we do casting later, all those things. And if they need more detailed after that, then we can sit down and have a discussion, and I can provide that. Yes?
Two questions. First, what's your favorite drink theater album? And has any of their work influenced your writing directly?
My favorite one is the new one, actually, and I know that's heresy, but I actually just saw them live, and it was a great show. Very classy, very loud, but very classy. And music does influence how I write. Every project that I write has a soundtrack that I create for that project to get me into the headspace to write for that. And so that tells my brain, okay, it's time, I'm working on the Division now. These are the Division songs. This is what I need to be doing.
You mentioned one game having thousands and thousands of barks in it, which was like an order of magnitude higher than I would have guessed. How does that number get so high, and how do you manage that, just the sheer quantity of those?
Okay, the question is, how do barks get to be so numerous, and how do you manage them? And the answers are multiplication and Excel. Let's say you've got a line for, he stabbed me. Now you're going to want, say, 10 variants for that. And let's say you've got 20 guards, all of whom are going to be in a fight, who need to be able to be stabbed. So all of a sudden that's 200 lines. And then you're going to be doing, well, it's not just one type of guards, it's 5 types of guards. So all of a sudden that's 1,000 lines. And you do that over and over and over again, and it adds up very, very quickly. Excel is actually a great tool for keeping track of it. We also have a game writing database tool called Oasis, which I'm not supposed to talk about, which is really very useful for that sort of thing. Any other questions?
So in a game, if you can skip dialogue, is that the writer's fault if the player skips so much dialogue, or the player's fault?
It is always the writer's fault. No, unfortunately, a generation-long series of awfully written cutscenes has trained players to skip the dialogue. And we are getting to a place where the writing in games is getting better and better, and people are wanting to do that less and less. But there was a long time when the cutscenes were just talky. And that trained players that nothing useful was happening, they didn't need to know what was going on. Now we've gotten better at doing stuff that's more focused, it's tighter, that's better written. And so I think you're seeing a little bit less of that, hopefully. But it's still the writer's fault. All the way in the back.
Hi, what is your approach for using this information on a text-based game?
Wow. I've only done one text-based game, and so text-based game is in many ways akin to writing fiction. You do need to do the description, you do need to do the world building, you do need to do all that stuff in the game. I would still make sure that your dialogue is as tight as possible. I would still make sure that you propel the action as quickly as possible, so the player is always playing, not just having more conversation.
When you're writing a game where the player character is supposed to be like a developed character in themselves, how do you balance keeping their characterization consistent when you know that the player could very well do something that would be out of character the way you've written them?
So writing an established character, the trick is to really establish that character strongly so the player buys into the fantasy of being that character. You want to make that character appealing, you want to make that character cool, you want to make that character interesting to be, and so they will go along with what you write and say and think for that character. My favorite one of those to write was Sam Fisher for the Splinter Cell series. Writing Sam was always great because he had a very dry sense of humor, and I would start with a couple of dry jokes at the beginning of the game and get people on my side, as it were, and go from there.
which discipline in a given pipeline and in a project you find yourself day to day working with the most? Just curious from your perspective. As far as a concept artist, an engineer.
It depends on where you are in the project. The question is, which discipline do I work with most? And at the beginning of the project, when we're in pre-production, that's when I'm talking to concept artists. That's when I'm talking to the creative director. That's when I'm talking to folks about the physical constraints of the system. Later on, that's when I'm talking to level designers. When we're talking about, okay, this line needs to be placed here, this line needs to be placed here, we need to have a conversation here, we can't have this vista here because it spoils what's going to happen in Act 3. Read that?
So, what would be your advice in like how much detail in the story you're supposed to write for something like a tabletop role-playing game where what you're writing isn't necessarily a part of the narrative that's going to be taking place?
Okay, well, it's been a while since my tabletop role-playing days, but I would always go with stuff that was impressionistic for tabletop role-playing rather than deterministic. The whole point of tabletop role-playing is that your content is outward. You're encouraging the player to go outward and build on what you have done. You don't want to limit them by saying, no, this building has only this many stories or something like that. You want to be as impressionistic and as useful as possible. So giving the idea of what's going on rather than bogging down in details.
If you're planning on writing a full series, like the whole story of a game has multiple parts, is it better to end the first draft to basically semi-book in the first one just in case it doesn't take off?
You always want to have a solid conclusion. The question is, if you're planning on writing a series, do you want to have a solid ending for the first one? And yeah, everything should be able to stand alone. Ideally, you might get people picking up the second one who didn't know the first one either. So you want everything to be self-contained but linked.
But then there's probably who do want to continue a certain story.
Yeah. Well, it is possible to have continuing iterations of a story that at the same time you don't necessarily need to know all the details of the first one.
For like very, very heavy text-based, for very call and response type text games, would you go about it as you're writing fiction a bit more, or would you still write it as a game but a bit more descriptive?
Okay, so the question is for heavy call and response games, would I write it more like fiction or more like a game, but go more descriptive? Something like that where the whole point of the gameplay is conversation, then I would go more towards a fiction model.
How challenging do you usually find it when it comes to making a game that has sort of like branching story paths or branching events in the story based off of players' decisions? Like, do you usually find it easier when it comes to giving sort of like a voice and or is it like something that also
I confess I haven't worked on a lot of branching stuff in my time, so I can't give you a definitive answer for this one and be honest about it. I think there's a lot of good stuff that can be done with branching, but also it is a great way to get the QA department to come after you with an axe.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess similar with the last question is like it's kind of like the same thing about like multiple how difficult would it be to like have like multiple endings for stuff?
Difficult for multiple endings, well, that's something that you talk about with a lot of other people.
Yeah.
One of the things that's going to happen is your producers are going to say, well, that's content the player's not going to see. And you need to win that argument if the player's not going to see all of the content.
Like say if you like do a certain side quest, like it's on a certain ending.
Excuse me?
Like I mean, it for like a game or a text-based story in game, like it's like if you do one thing at one time, at a certain time, you can get that ending.
Mhm.
I have a question about like what we use this customer who want to do writing, and then there are like this is sort of like how you practice sort of
Well, the great thing about game writing is you get paid. Sorry, did I say the quiet part loud there? In terms of moving into it, the best way to do it is, well, what you're doing, coming to conferences like this and talking to people who actually do the work. Get your hands on a engine like Twine and start playing around with making games and hearing your dialogue in games, hearing it played as opposed to just spoken. Go to game jams, talk to teams and say, hey, do you need writing? Do you need narrative? And just getting involved with making games and getting involved with the people who make games is the best way to get over that I know of. I came from a tabletop RPG background, and it was a very steep curve for me to learn all this stuff. I basically got thrown in the deep end while it was on fire. And fortunately, there are a lot of resources, the IGDA, or Writer Special Interest Group being one of them, for people who are interested in getting into game writing, and you can make use of those. But yeah, the first step is coming to a place like this and just talking to the folks who do the job. How many game writers do we have in here? Okay, good. Do you write games? Okay, then you're a game writer. You do the work, you're a game writer. All the way at the back?
Yes, have you ever worked on a pitch or a project where a story you were asked or required to do clashed with the gameplay itself? And how did you resolve that? And what do you wish the other side did? Or what did you like that they did to help you get through that?
Ideally, when you're pitching a story, you already know the basic outline of the gameplay, so you can write to support that. If I'm writing a Splinter Cell game, I know we're going to need a lot of dark places and air ducts to crawl through and things like that. There have been times when there has been conflict between what I wanted to do narrative-wise and what we wanted to do gameplay-wise. In that case, we sat down, we talked it out. There were very good reasons for some of the gameplay decisions, so I adjusted what I was doing to make sure that the gameplay was supported, but the story stayed strong.
How do you advocate for the inclusion of a writer, a full-time writer on a game project?
Well, the question is, how do you advocate for a full-time writer on a game project? The good news is that, at least in the AAA space at this point, it is a given that you're going to need narrative, that you're going to need full-time writers, that you're going to need people to do dialogue and character design, things like that, from the beginning of the project through to the end of it. And so that fight in large part has already been won. For smaller teams and smaller games, you may have contract writers come on for part of the project, but you can always make the case that narrative is there. Every game has narrative. And don't come at me with Tetris. Tetris has a little man who lives in the tower. He's got a story. I don't know what it is, but it's a story.
Do you explain a little on the Kermit test? Like, could you give an example of something that wouldn't pass the test?
An example of a line that wouldn't pass the Kermit test. Well, I've eliminated all of those. So, but it's just something that where you're coming along and writing, and suddenly you just start babbling, and you keep on saying the same thing over and over again, and you're just repeating yourself, and you're saying the same thing, and sooner or later you find yourself in the silly voice place, and you do that. And I cannot stress the importance of reading your dialogue aloud enough. You will bump. You will find the places that don't work. 99% of the time I've been in the studio where an actor couldn't say the line was because there was one syllable too many in the line, and that's something that could have been caught beforehand.
I just have one more thing, like related to the current testing. I've just kind of noticed sometimes when I play games that have like bits of dialogue here and there, like sometimes when I'm playing with friends, people read like out loud, where like I also end up doing this because I read my oh, I don't know how much take this line seriously.
Yeah, well, sometimes stuff sneaks through. Sometimes people try and be funny and fail. Sometimes stuff just sneaks through that isn't good writing. A lot of times you get last minute fixes that don't have time to go through iteration, that don't have time to go through table reads, and those don't always work out for the best. And it's unfortunate, but it's true.
How big of an issue is the narrative dissonance, and what are some techniques we use from a writer's perspective to manage it?
The best thing to manage ludonarrative dissonance with is an axe. In all seriousness, ludonarrative dissonance is something that should be nipped in the bud at the very beginning of the game. When you are writing the story for the game, when you are coming up with the basic narrative, when you are talking to the folks who are in the core team about what's going to happen, that's when you should find the ludonarrative dissonance and destroy it early. There have been games that have massive ludonarrative dissonance that have gone on to great success. I won't say it's a killer, but I will say it's something that definitely stops my enjoyment of a game. All the way to the back there? The answer to whether the story or the game design comes first is yes. Ideally, they are developed in conjunction.
About how long does it take to write a full game story?
How long does it take to write a full game story? Just the story can be a couple of months. But it is always evolving, it is always changing. Hey, we're splitting this level in two. Hey, we're cutting these 3 levels. So it is a never-ending job. And we are about out of time, so thank you all very much. I hope this was useful for you, and I will stick around. I started